developing countries do. So, moving on with our second argument about the principle of obligations between countries and citizens. So, we have three layers of analysis here. The first one, the retribution to the developing world. So, workers are born in the developing world. They own their heritage, they own their culture and their families to the developing world. Therefore, it is only fair that they retribute to their countries, to these developing worlds working there. They have to offer the retribution to these developing countries and offer their abilities and their skills. Thank you. Now, going through our second layer of analysis about the obligation by developed countries to support their developing counterparts. Developed countries have gotten where they are greatly by exploiting the natural resources of these developing countries. Thank you. Therefore, developed countries, all developing countries, support in their development process and not taking away these skilled workers. We already see that they recognize this in the status quo. Why? Because, as I already mentioned, they offer financial aid to these developing countries. So we see a clear recognition of how these developed countries recognize that they have an obligation to make these developing countries success and to make these developing countries prosper. Now, going through our third and last layer of analysis for this argument about the responsibility of developed countries to their skilled workers. So, we've shown through the first argument how skilled workers in developed countries will be struggling to get jobs, will struggle to obtain a job because these highly skilled workers that come from these developing countries will take the jobs and will take the opportunities away from them. The developing countries have a direct obligation towards their own citizens. They have a direct obligation towards these citizens that live in their country to offer them the jobs, to offer them job stability. And this is threatened by these people, by the highly skilled workers that are coming from these developing countries. And that's why, because we're in the best interest of the developing countries, that we're making a proposition.
Contrary to what team proposition states, they would not actually be helping the developing countries by allowing these workers to stay. Now, this is quite a broad statement for me to make, but we're going to go through the argumentation to show you how exactly, by forcing these highly skilled workers to stay within their own country, they are simply undermining their skills. And we're going to be addressing this as we look towards the argumentation that was presented. But before we get into that, let's look to the burdens. And the burdens that were presented, specifically number one, where they talk about how it would be beneficial for developing countries. Now, we're going to elaborate on this. Now, the team proposition must prove that it would be beneficial to force these highly skilled workers to stay within their country. Now, we're going to go to show throughout our argumentation that actually developing countries, as they define, don't have the proper resources or the same amount of resources as the upper class or higher class of developed countries do. Now, this is going to lead to a couple of different argumentations and lines of argumentations that's going to go to show how actually allowing these people to go to developed countries enhances their ability to create better products. However, if we look at what team proposition would like us to do, let's leave these particular workers in an area where they can no longer innovate and not be able to produce products that they have the capability of producing. Let's move down to the argumentation that was presented, starting out at the first point, where they talk about how they don't have enough workers. Specifically, we're taking the most valuable workers from a developing country. There are a couple of different reasons why this point is wrong. Now, we aren't actually taking them. The point is recruiting, we're hiring. But what is the reason? Why would they choose to leave in the first place if they know they would be helping? Well, this comes from a couple of different reasons. The first one, they could not be getting enough money. Think of it this way. If a country knows that nobody else is going to take their job, what incentive do they have of paying them more? What incentive do they have of giving them better materials? And what incentive do they have of giving them better working conditions? Really, there is none, because there's nowhere else or somebody else saying, hey, I'm looking to hire this worker. When we look at what team proposition to have us do, because we're leaving these people to work in an area where nobody else is wanting them, we can't have developed countries compete competing to have these workers, then there really is no incentive for developing countries to improve the quality of the worker's life. This is why it's not actually taking a worker, it's hiring them to improve their quality of life. And team proposition is there to actually show you why they would choose to leave in the first place. The reasons why they choose to leave is to better their own standard of living, which in no way is an immoral action whatsoever. And we're going to address that as we look at point 2 later on in the speech. However, we need to address the next point they presented, specifically looking at the principle of obligation. This was their second layer of analysis underneath this point. And the reason why this actually doesn't really apply is because there was no direct link made. Now keep in mind, they stated that they made the assumption that they are undermining their own workers. However, this point was really never proven. All they simply stated was that they're undermining their own workers by allowing them to leave. However, this really isn't the case, and as a matter of fact, I make the opposite assumption. They're actually undermining their workers by not allowing them to have the necessary resources that they could use to produce a better product. And until team proposition can go to show you that their developing countries are giving as much as they possibly can to these highly skilled workers, then we can clearly see that them leaving isn't actually a problem. Because if they're leaving, they're doing it for a better reason. And that reason is either better working conditions, more money, more benefits, and things that we'll be examining as we look through our substantives of our own. However, let's look down at the second point that I talked about obligations to a developing country. And I found this particularly interesting, specifically because it lacked a couple of logical links. The first one is improving quality of life. Now, a reason why someone would want to leave a third world country is so that they can have a better life. This is the reason why immigrants immigrate all the time, because they're leaving a place that they thought was bad in the first place, and then they go to a place that they know is safer. However, the reason why it lacks logical links is people don't stay in poverty just because it's tradition. And really, that's a very wrong standpoint to have. Just because I was born in a third world country where I didn't have a roof over my head doesn't mean I have to live my life that way the entire time. Just because I live in a low-income family doesn't mean I have to stay as a low-income person. If I can improve my quality of life, if I can have a roof over my head, and I can provide food for the table, I should absolutely do that no matter what. And I'm actually starting a new tradition that we are actually going to be living in a better quality of life. Simply stating that they have an obligation to stay in a developing country that's impoverished because they were born there simply is illogical. Let's move down to the next couple of points that we're going to be presenting. We're going to be looking at specifically the point of the opposition team. Now, in this speech, I'm going to be looking at how competition for a worker actually drives up quality of life. And it will drive up quality of life in two different ways, which we'll be examining. And then in the next speech, my partner Cole will look at the supply and demand effects that will have on the availability of jobs when we actually pass or look at what proposition team would be doing. So let's move into the first point: how competition drives up quality of life. Now, how exactly does this happen? Well, in developing countries, as we already pointed out earlier in the speech, they may have a lack of resources. And as going to point out, it's pretty illogical to assume that developing countries don't have all the same products, same materials, same working conditions as a developed country would have. Now, actually, we look at the first layer of analysis, so we're going to be looking at two. The first point, we're going to be looking at how competition actually drives up quality of life. And the reason why that is because it now requires people who are offering better pay, better materials, better benefits for a worker. It requires other people to be incentivized to offer even more better things. Which means now the worker is going to be going for the best possible option he can have, and whichever employer offers the best possible benefits and best pay. However, if we take a look at when competition isn't within the market, if we don't allow the developed countries to actually recruit from the developing countries, this means now workers are forced to stay there. What does this mean? If there is no competition, there is no incentive for better pay, better working conditions, better benefits. Why is that? Because the worker's not going anywhere. They're not going to quit their job specifically because they have no working conditions, because it's a developing country, it's hard to find a job anyways. What's specifically going to happen is now the government's going to say, I don't really need to do anything extra because you're not going to go anywhere. And because of that, we can clearly see that if developing countries or developed countries were allowed to recruit from developing countries, this would incentivize the employer, the government, whoever controls that specific labor part or sector of labor, to incentivize them to give them better pay, better materials, increase the quality of life of the workers, which would then increase the quality of life of the society that they are affecting. What we can see here is how competition is actually a good thing and why it needs to be put in place. Let's look at the second point, the second layer of analysis of how exactly competition would increase. And we're going to expand upon this in a little bit of different ways. On the first one, if developed countries receive a worker. Now, what happens if a developed country receives a worker? Well, it's probably because that employers are offering them better pay, better materials, and better benefits. And specifically, these three different reasons are reasons why someone would take a job in the first place. It has good money, they get good benefits, and they're not going to be working in a sweatshop for 12 hours a day. Now, if we actually take a look at what this would happen, if they went to a developed country, this now means that the worker in and of itself increases his quality of life. He can now no longer be living in an impoverished nation, and he creates a better life for himself. Now, what happens if he stays? If he stays in the developed country with competition in place, This means that he now chose to stay wherever he was, specifically because they offered him something better than the developed country could. So what does this mean? Now, the developed country is incentivized to offer him better materials, better pay, better working conditions. This means that now, even in a developed country, he is having an increased quality of life. Overall competition, and no matter how we look or how they choose, whether to go to a developed country, to stay in a developing country, whichever specific country offers a better quality of life, whichever one he chooses, overall increases the more benefits for the worker himself. Now this actually leads to a couple of impacts. The first one is that the workers benefit more from the opposition side. Specifically taking this point on its stance. What actually this point talks about goes to show you how if we have competition within a market for workers, when we see that different countries or different employers are actually fighting for a specific employee because they know they're going to benefit whatever industry they're in, this means that now the worker has different options. And those options are obviously going to be offering them more benefits, so they come to work for their specific company. When we look at how we benefit more because the workers' quality of life improves, and simply the proposition team's case really does not stand anymore.
We see that side opposition does not understand the developing world because we see that clearly there's opportunities in the developing world that can provide these workers a better life. So now, first of all, in this speech, I will start doing my refutation and then present the third and final argument that will be about the discrimination. Now, we have to start with refuting side opposition because they stated that people, if the skilled workers were staying in developing countries, they will be totally impoverished, which is not the case because they are skilled jobs in developing countries. And second of all, we define developing countries as they are able to prosper, that they are not as high as the developed countries. Now, we have to refute their first argument about competition. They stated that it provides competition between the developing world and the developed world because they're fighting for these skilled workers. We have two responses for this. First of all, no thank you. In the developing world, there is still competition for workers, so it is not as the workers will not have any competition and their conditions will be reduced, so this is a clear mischaracterization of their side of the house. Second of all, it is totally unfair to expect for developed countries to actually fight and to compete with developing countries that cannot actually have the resources. And they will leave the developing countries actually with no skilled workers whatsoever to improve the lives of millions of people that live in the developing countries. So we see that you're not benefiting the whole of developing countries' interests and not the whole population. Second of all, no thank you. We have that they stated that it will benefit the skilled workers and they will not be able to prosper in the developing world. We see, first of all, that we have stated in our first argument and in our second argument that these people these skilled workers are able to shine in the developing world where they have no more competition than in the developing world. And this is a clear case where we show that it is far better to actually shine in their own country. And second of all, we are stating in our third argument that will be presented later that there exists discrimination towards these skilled workers that will actually not benefit them in any way. We see that this is clearly the case, as we have seen, for example, in the campaign of Donald Trump, that they discriminate the foreigners. So we see that clearly there's not an improvement of the situation, but actually it diminishes their opportunities. No, thank you.
So we have to clear out that clearly we're not helping the developing countries, and we have seen that they have not touched the point about how we are improving the overall population of developing countries, and they have not refuted that actually the developed countries have the obligation to help these people. So we see that they have not refuted that point about how we actually improving the lives of the overall developing countries, and second of all, they're not refuting about the part about natives that actually are left with no jobs. So we see that clearly this is not the case, and they're not benefiting neither, they're not benefiting neither the developing countries, neither the natives in that we see in the status quo. But do you disagree?
Community resolution states they recruit, so they don't actually not have a job, they have a job when they are recruited by the development countries, right?
But we have stated in our second argument, it is unfair that you expect developed countries and the developing world to actually compete, and you leave the developing world without any workers. And it is totally unfair that you're leaving them without the prosper and without the hope of these skilled workers that are so needed, in fact, to actually the developing countries to turn into developed countries. No, thank you. So we see that overall, we're benefiting the whole population of the developing countries and the natives that live in the developed countries, and they have not proven any kind of substantial harm that our policy would do. Now, moving on with our third and final argument about discrimination. This will prove that this policy provided by our side of the House will decrease tension between natives and the foreign workers. We see that in the status quo, few jobs opportunities are provided to these natives, and they have felt this, and we have seen their protests. We've seen that natives are feeling like their own governments are not protecting their jobs, and this is actually negative for the world. So what does this actually create in our world? We see that natives are actually seeing that their jobs are being taken. This increases the stigma towards foreign workers in the developing world, creates more tension between them, and that is why we have seen the surge of politicians that take advantage of this, such as Donald Trump, that are stating that they are taking our jobs. So we see that clearly this is the case of how this is damaging the world and actually is not benefiting anyone. We see that it creates more division between the developing countries and the developed world, and we see this is not what we want in the status quo. Second of all, it is putting in danger the lives of these developing country workers that actually go to prosper. They face hate, they face discrimination, and this is not a good environment to actually be able to develop. So what will this policy actually do? It will decrease the surge of racist politicians that take advantage of this, such as Donald Trump and extreme nationalism that we see in the actual world. So we see that this is very important to decrease the number of tensions that we see nowadays. It will improve the lives of natives, and they will actually be able to find jobs, and they will no longer feel this tension between the developing workers and them. We see, second of all, that skilled workers will actually be able to prosper in their own developing countries. They will no longer experience hate from natives, so they will be faced a better and more enriching environment. Second of all, we see that clearly racism is very damaging in the developing of a person, of these skilled workers. What happens when you're in a bad environment? You're not allowed to actually prosper, to have a positive mindset, to actually have the forces to actually develop. So we see that these actually harms high-skilled workers that are living in developing countries, and they don't allow them to thrive because they actually are facing hate throughout their world, and we see that this is negative not only for the skilled workers, but for the natives. So that is why we're so very proud of both.
Did Donald Trump state that foreigners were taking our jobs, or that we have an overregulation and that's why
he stated you're taking our jobs, mentioning the part of the developing countries. So we see that this is a clearly analysis that actually they're blaming the developing countries that this is happening. So we see that your side of the House is not improving the lives of neither the developing workers, neither the natives. So we see that we are in the best interest of both natives, of both developing countries that they have not proven to improve, of the developed world, and actually the world's tension overall. Thank you very much.
improve the kind of argument for the proposition?
A key part of the motion that's been presented to us today is the phrase highly skilled workers. And as the proposition team got up to you and said in their very first speech that highly skilled workers was defined as having a college education and was having a high level paying job. So ultimately we see at the end of the day, the proposition team still has the burden to prove to you that if these workers were to stay in their developing nations, in developing countries, they would first of all be able to find work. And second of all, if they were able to be paid enough and they were able to have and be provided the materials and resources needed in order to have a steady and stable job. Ultimately, at the end of today's debate round, we see the motion has been presented to us today because there is a harm in the status quo. Because right now we see that people leave their homes and countries for a reason. It is strange to the opposition team that the proposition team seems to be arguing in a world where workers are leaving for no reason. They seem to be arguing that there's no reason, that there's no problem in these developing nations that would cause workers to leave. But we see that there is such a great problem that countries would leave that workers would leave their countries, their homes, their families, in order to go find a better job in a different place. We see that the developing nations are facing this problem because they're not able to offer these highly skilled workers, especially and specifically as the motion is asking us to debate, high enough paying jobs or jobs that will accommodate the level of skill that they have. The first thing that I want to do is I want to look at the substantive that the opposition team has presented and then look at the final substantive that the opposition team is going to present, that of looking at the supply and demand and how ultimately these countries are left even more in a bad state because of high unemployment. So the first substantive that they brought up was that they basically told you that competition between developing and developed nations is wrong and shouldn't happen. We have a lot of problems with this, starting off with the first one. My first response is that they leave for a reason, right? So these workers are not being accommodated in their countries, and so they want to go with you. They want to go to a different country in order to find a better job. What's the second impact of this? The second impact is when there's competition, there's a standard. Now, of course, the opposition team realizes that the currency in the U.S. and let's say, for instance, the Czech Republic is completely different. No, thank you. The amount of money that people get paid is different. The jobs are, the way that they live is different, right? So there's not direct competition, but we're saying that if developing countries, are never worried about their workers needing to go find a better job to get that either pays more money or has better working conditions, then they will never raise their standards. That is what the opposition team is arguing in today's debate round. We're not saying that there should be direct competition between like the UK and a country in Africa or something. We're saying that if there's never a threat of workers leaving their countries and going to a different one to get, higher paying jobs or jobs that will give them the direct correlation of money that they deserve for putting themselves through the education and becoming a highly skilled worker, then the standards will never change in countries. So that's ultimately what we're trying to do as the opposition team. We want developing, we want developing countries to become developed countries, but the only way to do this is by accommodating workers and by having standards and by being able to have workers that want to stay in their country and not leave. The next point underneath this that they talked about, is they said it's better to shine in their own world. And our response is that they never responded to the analysis or the reason why this motion we were asked to debate in the first place was why do these people want to leave? They want to leave because they're not being accommodated, because they put themselves through a hard education and they become labeled as a highly skilled worker, and either they don't have a job that accommodates this or it doesn't pay them enough money. So we see that they say they want to shine in their own countries, but that's an assertion. It doesn't actually respond to the reason as to why workers want to leave in the first place. They should not have an obligation, to stay in a country where they cannot improve their quality or where they cannot achieve the highest level of quality of life. What we're looking at is should these highly skilled workers be able to find the absolute best job and the best quality of life for themselves. And we believe as an opposition team the only way to do this is to have developed nations be able to recruit them or have the opportunity to recruit them. No, thank you. The next one I'd like to look at is that if there's lack substantive of discrimination. Now, their first point on making this was simply that developed countries are undermining their own workers, and that there's few jobs for the natives. And they brought up the example of the United States and Donald Trump. But before I respond to that,
do you realize that there will still be competition because workers can move between the developing countries? So there is still competition to acquire these workers.
So if I hear them correctly, they're saying they can move between developing nations. But we are saying that the developing nations, we agree that there's basically the same standard. So developing nations falls under a category of developing nations, so they all essentially have the same rules and regulations. I mean, it differs for various countries, but there is a difference between developing nations and developed nations. And these developing nations, whether it be one or all of them, cannot give the full opportunity for their citizens, for highly skilled workers to have a job in their economy and in their country, then we are saying that developed nations should have the opportunity to come in and recruit them so that they can get a better job. The next point, so going back to the point about Donald Trump, now they never really responded to the TOI that my partner got up and asked, and essentially this argument about Donald Trump isn't the true reason. What Donald Trump was saying was he was talking specifically about rules and regulations for specific companies in the United States. So we're going to discredit the Donald Trump example and really just respond to their logical reasoning or their idea behind this. And essentially they claim that that their countries are undermining their own workers in the Western world by getting highly skilled workers. I have a couple of responses to this. The first is that of highly skilled workers. We're not just talking about regular labor workers. For example, if we're going to use the example of the United States, people that are coming across the border and doing lower wage jobs, we're talking about people that you need something that you need a college education for. So because of that, we see that there's regulations in a company. So they talk about discriminatory and people not liking them and treating them unfairly. If you have a highly skilled worker, they're going to be working in a company in a developed world that literally has rules against discrimination. So you cannot claim this and then not look at the actual impacts in the real world. That when you are recruited in a high-level, skilled-paying job, there are literally anti-discrimination laws in developed countries that say that this cannot happen, right? So the next thing I want to look at is that of our substantive of supply and demand. And this is simply the argument that right now, people in developing countries, right, they have the opportunity to go to developed countries to pursue a better quality of life if they are not achieving it, if they are not presented it with the opportunity in the developing world. Well, if you go with the propositions team world and you say that no longer are you able to do this, you have to stay with an obligation to stay in your own countries, all of a sudden you have disproportional supply and demand. What does this mean? This means that there is a supply, a very large amount of supply of people that put themselves through high levels of education and become highly skilled workers that no longer are able to find jobs. What is the impact of this? The impact of this is that they're either there's going to be a high unemployment rate, or they're going to be forced to go into a job that doesn't actually accurately represent the skills that they have. So essentially, they went through all this education for nothing because they're forced to have a job that's lower pay and lower skills than what they studied for. And it's for all these reasons to help the developing world to be strong in their proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are the side of the House that stands in the best interests of not only the workers that this motion is about, the high-skilled workers of the developing world, but also in the best interests of the developed countries that are implementing this policy, of their workers, and of the developing societies as a whole, which is why we believe that we should take this debate. I would like to illustrate this through 3 points of contention that were presented in today's debate. Firstly, which is most beneficial towards the interests of workers on both sides of the world. Secondly, which one is in the best interest of countries? And finally, which policy is most justified in principle? So let's begin by taking a look at the interests of workers in the developing world. So they have characterized the developing world as a place that has absolutely no opportunities, a place where people will starve if they stay, and a place that they must flee almost immediately. And this is illustrated by the fact that they have described the situation of a high-skilled worker as that of, if they don't leave, they're going to have to work in a sweatshop. This is a complete mischaracterization. So thank you. And so what we see is that there are key opportunities in the standard of living between developed countries and developing countries. But the way in which they have portrayed the scenario is so exaggerated that it leads us to making false assumptions about the way in which high-skilled workers are actually treated in developing countries. In developing countries, high-skilled workers are given a lot of value proportional to the rest of the population. They are provided with job opportunities, and they very often have actually high standards of living because the costs of things are so low as a result of the poverty in the country that they can manage to sustain a very high quality of life. But what happens under the status quo is that there is a large inferiority complex within developing countries. What happens is that there is always this idea of people going to developed countries and fulfilling their dreams there. An idea which is not always accurate because it assumes that class mobility in the developed world is far higher than it actually is, and that standards of living are far higher for these kinds of high-skilled workers. A good example of this can be illustrated with the situation of the Cuban people when they moved to Miami. But first, I'll take your point.
You'd agree the resolution states they're recruited, so they have a job and a highly skilled worker, so they would be able to have a high quality of life, whether they're in a developed country or not.
We don't really understand that point because you've just conceded that they do have a high quality of life, whether they are in the developing world or in the developed world. But anyways, let's move on with the example that I was just about to provide. In Miami, where we see a large migration of Cubans, we see that there is this image of going there and reaching the same standards of living as very high-reaching American citizens. But what actually happens is that many people who have been trained in Cuba, many people who have received high-quality Cuban education, no longer have their skills as valued in the United States. We see, for example, Cuban doctors moving massively to the United States and then having to stay as taxi drivers or having to stay with another such low-skilled job. And why is this? Because while in the United States there is an oversupply of high-skilled workers, while in the United States it is really hard for a person of high skill to gain a job, in developing countries there are a lot of opportunities for these kinds of people because there aren't enough workers with these kinds of skills. The developing world's workers to stay where they are. No, thank you. And so it is also more beneficial for the developed countries, as we have seen. Firstly, because it will alleviate the unemployment among the talented youth inside these developed countries, but also because it will contribute to a fall in discrimination. And they have said discrimination does not apply to high-end workers, because high-end workers work in high-end companies which have really effective anti-discrimination laws. Maybe this is within the working environment, but we see that discrimination and racism spreads everywhere. We see cases of highly skilled doctors, highly skilled engineers being discriminated because of their race, because of their religion in the developed world. And all of this stems from the idea that people in developing countries are taking over. They're taking over the jobs, they're taking over the culture of the population, and this is as a result of their presence. So, if we see this discrimination decrease, then it would be far more beneficial for the developed world. And ultimately, it would be best for both sides of the world. But finally, we would like to say that we are justified in principle because we believe, firstly, in the principle of developed countries supporting the developing world, as we have stated. We believe that developing workers have a need to retribute to their country, and we believe in the principle that we have stated about developing countries being supported by developed countries. For all of those reasons, we are proud to propose it. Thank you.
Now welcome Sam.
and he did it very admirably. But what I'm going to do in this speech is respond to those three little bundles of argumentation, kind of the main clash points, but then go back through what he didn't do, which is go through the line-by-line argumentation, substantive by substantive, and show you the arguments that he dropped, which were the very arguments that refute the arguments he just made. So let's first of all look at what he was talking about. First of all, he talked about workers, then he talked about countries, then he talked about principle. Let's talk about all three, then we'll talk about the 5 substantives that have been presented in the round. First of all, he talked about workers and how they basically have an obligation to stay in their country. This is almost comedic. The UN Declaration of Human Rights says that people have the human right to move. They do not have an obligation to stay, not now, to stay. They do not have an obligation to stay in a country that is impoverished, where they currently have a job that may not pay them enough money, that may not live up to their education, where they may not be making enough money for their family or to benefit their community. The proposition is telling you that they have an obligation to stay in that country, which is utterly false. And then the proposition came up and they said this is bad for workers because we don't know if they'll actually be able to get a job in a developed country. And they brought up the example of essentially people like Cuban doctors going to Miami and then having to stay there and become something like a taxi driver. Here's the difference. Those doctors went there voluntarily. What were they not? They were not recruited. Here's what the motion says. It talks specifically about recruitment. Recruitment means a company in a developed country specifically wants that person for a job. That means they will have a job in the developed country. It's not as if these workers are going to the developed country wondering, where do I get a job? That's not how it works. They're being recruited by a company specifically for that job. Next, I would like the proposition with regards to the worker argument. They talk about how workers can have great, awesome, fine living conditions in developing countries. I want the proposition team to answer the question we've been asking in the entire debate round, which is, if it's so great in developing countries, why are we debating this motion? Why are workers leaving those developing countries? If they can really prove the benefits and if they can answer that question, then that's great, but we've been asking them for the entire debate round and they haven't been able to do it. And then finally, with regards to what the proposition has been saying, they basically said that it would be better if these workers could remain in their countries because those countries need highly skilled workers. Here's the problem. The workers are leaving those countries. Right now we have a system where workers leave the developing countries and they go to the developed countries, and those developing countries are operating with the highly skilled workers that they can retain. What happens if we have this sudden influx of highly skilled workers who used to go to developed countries but now stay in developing countries? They won't be able to find jobs because right now employers are already hiring the highly skilled workers that are there while other countries are hiring other highly skilled workers. So there's going to be an influx of workers who would regularly go to other developed countries but are now staying in developed countries. This plays right into the argument that Nicole talked about, supply and demand. If we have a greater supply of highly skilled workers, what does that economically mean? Less demand. The impact of that is what? Less pay, worse working conditions, harder hours, a worse job, and a job that doesn't live up to the education that these highly skilled workers actually work for. Workers are not benefited by voting proposition. Moving on down to where he talked about countries. Basically, he said that countries basically needed, or developing countries basically needed these workers, while ignoring the point that we talked about competition. How in the current system, there's competition which ultimately benefits everyone because it improves the quality of life for these workers. If we have two entities, two parties competing for a worker, what do they try to do, especially if it's a highly skilled worker? Well, they try to outdo each other. I can give you this salary, plus I can help with your education. And the other party says, I can give you this salary, help with your education, and give you health care. And so we have these competing entities trying to outdo the other, which ultimately improves the quality of life of the workers. And when they were talking about whether or not countries are benefited, I want to respond with the fact that voting opposition benefits developing countries. Here's why. If the workers are benefited, the countries are benefited. I think both teams would agree to that. Because the opposition team benefits the workers, they also benefit these developing countries. Why? Because if workers go to developed countries and they take a job there and they get what? More revenue, better working conditions, what does that allow them to do? It allows them to, first of all, support their family, and second of all, if they ever retire, if they ever go back to those developing countries, it allows them to invest in their local community with the resources and the revenue that they've gained while working a job in a developed country. Local communities are absolutely benefited because workers gain extra revenue, resources, talent, and skill in developed countries that they can then bring back to developing countries and invest into their families and their local community. And then finally, the proposition speaker talked about the argument in principle, and this is where he brought up basically the racism argument, talking about specifically the example of Donald Trump, talking about how there's some kind of racism going on in developed countries against workers from developing countries. Now, my colleagues and I in today's debate round absolutely believe that prejudice and racism is a serious problem that has to be addressed. The problem is that their example has literally nothing to do with their argument. What Donald Trump was talking about during his campaign was essentially saying that here's what's happening. We have so many regulations in America that corporations are leaving and going to other countries. Exactly the reverse opposite from the argument that the proposition team is trying to make. They're trying to apply this argument to essentially workers coming to our country, when in reality, Donald Trump was talking about corporations leaving our country because of the regulations that are currently in place. The example has no applicability to today's round. So let's move on to the 5 substantives, which I'll address after I actually do take a question.
So, if you can say that the only reason that Donald Trump was attacking these workers was that the companies were leaving, then how can you justify the following phrase? They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, the people actually moving into the developing world.
Completely different from what you're talking about. He was wrongly actually talking about immigrants when he said that. He was talking about immigrants who, first of all, weren't coming for jobs, and second of all, weren't recruited, like the motion explicitly calls for. Way different, completely different. First substantive that we talked about was the effects on developed and developing countries. And this is again where the proposition fails to answer our question. Because what they did is got up here and reiterated their arguments without responding to analysis or our responses. We said they leave for a reason, and competition provides a standard. Look on your notes, it's right there. We made those arguments. They leave for a reason. Why did they leave? We asked the proposition that. They can't answer it. And we said that competition is a standard, and that standards and countries have no incentive to change. Think about it this way, like we've been talking about the entire round. If a country essentially has the opportunity to keep a worker with no competition from any other country, why would they ever pay the worker more money? Why would they ever give the worker better living conditions if they know that the worker is never going to leave? That's the standard that's absolutely necessary. The reason that this is so crucial is because side opposition is the one that benefits the workers. Moving on down, I want to talk about the third substantive that was presented by the proposition, that of discrimination. We've already talked about this. This is a response that we made talking about how their example was completely unapplicable to the round. Then they talked about, under their second substantive, supply and demand. That was the point that we brought up, which still hasn't been responded to by the proposition. And I believe that this is crucial. This is a crucial point, because if you vote proposition, we have an influx of workers who go to college, work very hard to get an education, and then try to join the workforce. But they used to be going to developed countries. Now they're staying in developing countries, which means that we now have a greater supply, which means less demand, which means worse working conditions, less money going to those communities, less money benefiting developing countries. At the end of the day, the proposition does completely the opposite of what both teams are trying to do, which is benefit workers and benefit ultimately developing countries.
If they're a doctor or something, then they would choose to stay. But choose the best quality of life. So first of all, talking about standards. This has basically gone unaddressed by the propositions being throughout today's debate. I talked about this in my second opposition speech, and I essentially made the link and the logical connection that when you have developed nations coming in and having the ability to recruit your highly skilled workers, you have incentive to make them stay. You have incentive to pay them a proportional amount of money to the level of skill of job that they have. You have an incentive to create better working environments to basically provide them the best quality of life for the job that they have because they're highly skilled workers, right? So it creates a standard. But what if that goes away? What if there's no threat of people leaving their country if you don't present them with the best job or the best working conditions, et cetera, et cetera? Well, what happens is that it basically lowers the standard. So now there literally is no incentive for countries or companies or developing nations to provide their people with the best working conditions, with the best jobs. We believe that competition raises the standards inherently, and that's why we believe ultimately that companies or countries, should be able to recruit highly skilled workers from developing nations. And the second point is that simply that workers should have a choice to choose the best quality of life. At the end of the day, that's what the motion is asking us to debate, whether or not it's good for the developing countries and whether or not it's good for these workers. We believe that as an opposition team, that what we have to do is basically present and give these workers the ability to choose their quality of life. If they don't have the quality of life that they want in developing countries, then they should have the ability to choose to go to a different place to pursue what they think a better life would be. At the end of the day, we see the proposition team simply has not proven us to you. And on the second point underneath this is that of the developing nations, and whether or not it's good for the country, we haven't seen any analysis or response to my last point about supply and demand. That if you no longer have being able to recruit highly skilled workers, then you have an influx of workers, and then there might not be enough jobs in a country, and so you have people that either won't get paid enough money, will be unemployed, or will have to take a lower standard job. So we see that ultimately it won't be good either for the workers, and it won't be good for the countries. So the best choice in order to make a better world and better living standards for the people in developing nations, we vote for opposition. Because we stand here to defend the rights of developing countries and developed countries, we are very proud to propose. First of all, I would like to clarify that the side opposition has made a clear contradiction in their POI. They conceded that high-skilled workers in developing countries actually have a good condition, and this is why they have contradicted their case, because they are stating throughout their speeches that this is not true, while in his POI he actually cleared out that they have a good condition. So this is a clear contradiction of the side opposition, and we are winning because of this, and three main factors. First of all, in our first speech, we mentioned that we had to prove to us that we are benefiting the developing world, the developed world, and developing countries' workers, and that it is morally justified. And I will prove to you that why we have won these two burdens of truth. First of all, the main clash, improving the lives of developing workers. We stated clearly about discrimination that we see because they are taking their jobs, and skilled workers that come from developing countries are actually occupying the jobs that could be possibly taken by natives, and they have not refuted that. They just stated that this is not true, and just stated with the refuting the point about Donald Trump, but they have not refuted the analyses that we provided. Second of all, they mentioned contradiction in the third speech about how immigrants were actually reputed by the Cubans, and they will actually not having a good benefit in these countries. Then we mentioned about the fact of shining. We mentioned about how in the developed countries they don't have as much opportunities to shine because there's more competition, while in developing countries they're able to shine more and to actually improve the lives of millions of people inside their country, and they're able to prosper more. they mentioned about the point about supply and demand, and that there will not be any kind of workers in jobs for workers in the developing country. We say that this is not true, and we clearly see how in the developing countries there's a need for skilled workers because they are living in the status quo and they have needed to this to happen. So this is actually their second argument has failed in this debate. Second of all, we have about the developed world and developing countries. They mentioned the fact about competition, and we stated clearly that this competition is not fair because obviously the developed countries have more opportunities and have more to offer than the developing countries. So this clearly leaves the countries without any kind of skilled workers that they actually need to improve the lives of millions of people that live in these developing countries. So we see that clearly this is leaving the country without any skilled workers that can improve the lives of the overall population of the developing countries. We see that clearly we mentioned that there is still competition because workers can still move within the developing world, and this will actually still be competition for workers. So we see that there's a clear lack of analysis of how there would not be competition. Second of all, they stated that workers could go back to their countries after being in the developed world. But we say that actually these workers have already spent their money in the developed world and actually are not benefiting the developing world as such that needs them so much. And the third point on this class is about natives. They never responded about the natives in the